Right. In our first study, we took a look at Genesis chapters 1 through 3 and what God originally intended and what got lost and how it got lost. And then we looked briefly at Revelation 20, 21, and 22 as a way of seeing what God was going to do to put it back together again, how he was going to fix it, how he was going to restore his original intention. And we looked at some of those verses in Genesis chapters 1 through 3 and saw what they had to say. Today, I thought we'd take a look at the verses in Revelation 20, 21, and 22 that, in a sense, bookend the Genesis chapters 1 through 3. I made the statement that you could take out all the intervening pages and you'd have a complete story, and you would. You'd miss a lot, obviously. All those pages are not there for nothing. There's a lot of good stuff in there that we need to know, especially the story of Jesus. But Revelation and Genesis give us the beginning and the end and help us to know where we came from and where the story ultimately goes if we, in fact, want to be a part of it. So let's take a look at the Revelation part and see how it bookends the Genesis part, and a little more specifics about what the restoration work is going to be that God's going to have to accomplish in order to make things the way he wanted them to be. In our last study, we talked about how Genesis chapters 1 to 3 and Revelation chapters 20 to 22, the first book of the Bible and the last book of the Bible, the first chapters in the first book of the Bible and the last chapters in the last book of the Bible, we talked about how they were kind of bookends, how they sort of paralleled each other, and how Genesis told the story of how God created the creation and how the creation was ruined and fell into something that the Bible calls this present evil age, this sinful world that you and I know and have lived in. This is you and me down here. This is the only world we've ever known because we were born into it, lived all our lives, will probably die in it, like our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and so on. This is our world, and this world is a fallen world. It is not the world that God created up here, described in Genesis. It is the world that fell from what God intended and became this present broken, evil age. But Revelation, the last few chapters, describes how God is going to put things back together again, and he is going to restore all things, and he is going to make sure that the world that comes is as ideal as the world that was. So God's intention will be realized, his original intent of a perfect world with no threats, an unhindered connection between God and humans, perfect harmony, where love rules and we have all unity. That's going to be restored. Another way of thinking about this would be to say that up here, with God's original intention, we have wholeness, whole people. The relationship with God is whole. The creation is whole. The family is whole. Society is whole. But down here, we have brokenness. And this brokenness is what caused the Buddha, when he looked at the world, to utter the first great moral truth of Buddhism, which is life is unsatisfactory, which means that when you look at the world, you see the brokenness. Now, yeah, you see some great stuff too. I mean, certainly there are roses on the thorns, and the sky is blue, and babies are beautiful, and puppies are cute, and there's wonderful good things still left in this broken world. But on the whole, when you look around, you see brokenness. You see the brokenness of the world. You see war. Societies are broken. Economies are broken. There's poverty and inequity. You look at relations between peoples. There's racism. There's crime. There's theft. There's disrespect. There's murder. There's violence. There's all kinds of brokenness even inside of people. There's emotional brokenness. neuroses and psychoses, or lots more detail the psychiatrist can give you about just what kind of emotional brokenness, what kind of psychological brokenness people know. There's physical brokenness. Just ask a physician just how broken the body can be. We've got cancers and infections and COVID-19 and measles and mumps and all kinds of things that make up the brokenness of the physical body. And besides the brokenness of society, the brokenness of people, the brokenness of relationships, the brokenness that is inside of us, we have what causes all of this, which is the broken relationship with God. It's as though God is up here and we are down here, and this relationship that's supposed to be a solid, firm, beautiful, open relationship between God and us is broken and chiseled away and weakened, and in some places it ceases pretty much to exist, and there is a very tenuous sort of relationship between God and the human being that once was made in his image and delighted to be in his presence. And that's the ultimate source of all this brokenness. It is the brokenness in the relationship with God that creates the physical brokenness, the social brokenness, the economic brokenness, the national brokenness, the cosmic brokenness that is life in this broken, fallen world. Clearly, if God is going to deal with the brokenness in this fallen world, and he's going to restore his creation to wholeness, the kind of wholeness it once had, he's going to have to do something pretty dramatic. He's going to have to restore broken human beings, some of whom are already dead, and some of whom are in the process of dying, and some of whom are carrying around cancers they don't even know about, and some of whom seem to be in the pink of health, but who will ultimately get old and sick and die. He's going to have to do something about human beings. He's going to have to do something about his creation, because there's a whole lot of the creation that's going to have to be put back together. There's going to have to be something done about society. But most important of all, there's going to have to be something done about this connection between human beings and God. It's going to have to be rebuilt. It's going to have to be restored. And that is going to involve getting rid of this thing called sin. Now, this thing called sin is not just sins. If it were just sins, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But when we sinned, something went fundamentally wrong inside of us. We inherited a bent to evil, a propensity to evil, a desire to do wrong. We became, instead of focused on God, where God was everything to us, we focused on ourselves, where our own selfish desires became the things that we lived for, the things that we wanted more than anything else. And that's the essence of what this sin is. Someone said sin, there's a great big I right in the middle of sin. And that I is I. It's me. It's you. It is each of us ourselves who become the center of our lives instead of God being the center of our lives. And when we are the center of our lives, rather than God being the center of our lives, then people get pushed into a lower place as well. And so we abuse people. We use people. We disconnect not only from God, but from one another. And all kinds of interpersonal problems arise, as well as the connection between God and human beings being a problem. So God's going to have to deal with all this. So how is he going to deal with sin? Well, in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, God shows us what he's going to do with sin. So let's take a look at Revelation chapter 20, and then we'll come back to this. Okay, now this is Revelation 20, verses 1 to 6. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who was the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be let out for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. All right, a couple of things to notice here. First of all, notice this idea of the second death over here. John says the second death has no power over these. Now, if there's a second death, there must obviously be a first death. And the first death is probably the death that we all experience, that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have already experienced before you, the first death in which our heart stops and our brain waves cease and we die. But John says there's a second death coming, and this second death is going to be more final. We'll look at that in a minute. But it also says that there is a first resurrection, and it says, blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. So apparently there is not only a first resurrection, but also a second resurrection. I'll make that look like an S. I told you writing was not my strong suit. All right, so there's a first resurrection and a second resurrection, and a first death and a second death. So just hold on to those thoughts for a few minutes. Let's go back now. The angel seizes the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil, and Satan. He's got a number of names here in Revelation 20. And he binds him for 1,000 years. Now, Revelation 20 follows, obviously, 19 chapters in Revelation that describe all kinds of things that happen upon the earth, in which things get worse and worse and worse until it seems like it just can't get any worse. And the people who are trying hard to follow God are the target of the devil's great wrath. And the devil is successful in working on some other people to get them to join him in his wrath. And then comes the climax of all of that, and then this happens. The angel comes down, and right in the middle of his doing his worst, the angel grabs the devil and he binds him, and he throws him into a pit, and he locks it, and he seals it. And this marks the beginning of what is referred to as the 1,000 years, or quite literally the millennium. You've probably heard of the millennium. It's something that takes place in the future where the devil is incapacitated. And then there's an interesting scene which involves thrones and judgment and such like that. And we don't need to worry too much about all of this right now. We simply need to recognize that at the end of this broken, messed up world, when things are about as bad as they can get, God steps in. And he says to the angel, now. And the angel grabs the devil, chains him up, throws him into the pit, and a period of 1,000 years begins. And this 1,000 years is marked by, at its beginning, a resurrection, and at its end, a second resurrection. And those who are in the first resurrection are those who have experienced the first death. Those who are in the second resurrection are going to experience something called the second death. The first death is a temporary death. The second death is an eternal death. And what these things are the parallels to what we saw happening back there in the book of Genesis. So let's go back to that for a minute and take a look. Okay, so here we are again back at our diagram. And what we're looking at is this segment in time right in here. Now notice I drew that line kind of thick for a reason, because there are a number of things that happen here. What we just read about in Revelation chapter 20, Let me write Revelation 20 here. What we just read about in Revelation 20 happens at the beginning of the restoration of all things. And then 1,000 years later comes the end of the restoration of all things, at the end of this period that is described as the millennium. So what we have here is a period of restoration that takes place over 1,000 years. And it begins with the binding of the devil so that he can't do what he has been doing all through this period of time, and what he instigated up here and was partly responsible for here. So the devil is incapacitated, and there's this interesting 1,000-year period with a resurrection at the beginning of it and a resurrection at the end of it. And we'll look in more detail at just what those things are. But notice that it is this 1,000-year period that marks the beginning of the restoration that God is going to accomplish to put things back again. And obviously, what he needs to put back again is the same kind of stuff that went wrong over here. So what went wrong over here? Well, there was obviously the question of sin. Sin needs to be handled. There was the question of guilt. Guilt needs to be handled. There was the question of shame. There was the question of blame. There was the question of conflict or enmity, if you want to call it that. The disconnection between God and humans. All that stuff. There was the issue of death. All of these things are problems that arose over here in Genesis chapter 3 and that need to be solved over here before the restoration can take place. So this period of time is the time during which these things get solved, with the issues of sin and guilt and shame and blame and enmity and disconnection and the death of death all have to take place in order for the restoration to be accomplished up here. You with me? All right, now let's go back to Revelation again. Okay, so here we are back in Revelation 20, and we're reading the following verses now, verses 7 through 15. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Okay, let's just stop there for a minute. And notice that this comes when the 1,000 years are ended. And clearly, the 1,000 years that Satan had to be all by himself and think about what he'd done didn't do him any good. Because as soon as he's released, he comes out and he starts doing the same things that he was doing before. He starts making trouble. And it says here a lot of symbolic language in Revelation, a lot of stuff that has been interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted over and over again by many, many people trying to figure out what it means. I'm not going to wade into that swamp. I'm simply going to point out the highlights. And the highlights are that the devil didn't benefit from his 1,000-year imprisonment. He was still the same guy he was before. He comes out, he starts doing exactly what he was doing before. He hates God just as much as he ever did, and he starts immediately attempting to deceive the nations, to deceive people and lead them into conflict with each other and, most of all, against God. This time, however, something terrible happens. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. That is the final destruction that the devil, Satan, whose name in Hebrew means adversary, receives from the hand of God. So at this period of the close of the 1,000 years, the unrepentant, unreformed, totally consistent adversary of God is destroyed. And We won't worry a lot about what all of this means, the beast, the false prophet, and all of that kind of stuff. We'll just note, again, the high points. The devil meets his end, finally. He's been doing dirty work against God for all this time. He's given a chance to think about it. He thinks about it. He comes out. He's right back, committed to the same things that he was committed to before. God says, all right, that's enough. I've had it. And God destroys him. He is thrown into, and please note this, the lake of fire. We're going to see this lake of fire thing again. Okay? All right, let's go on. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Notice, please, death and Hades, hell, the grave, were thrown into the lake of fire. And this is the second death, the lake of fire. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. This is what we call the final judgment. And once again, we're not going to get bogged down in the details. We're going to note the high points here, that after God has disposed of Satan, the great adversary, and tossed him into the lake of fire, there is a judgment. And all of those who have ever lived on the face of the earth, the living and the dead, are judged. And those who are not found written in the book of life are once and for all ultimately destroyed. Now, this might seem pretty harsh, and it is, but please keep in mind as you consider it what God has done to try to woo these people, try to win them, try to save them, try to get them to come over and be reconciled to him. We need to consider that before we go on. All right, so here we are back at our diagram again. It's fairly obvious that if God is going to restore the beautiful universe that he had originally created and make it again what he wanted it to be forever and ever, he's going to have to deal with the question of sin. He's going to have to somehow get rid of sin because sin is a problem. Sin causes all kinds of other things like guilt and shame and blame and enmity and disconnect. It also causes death. So somehow God's going to have to deal with sin. He's going to have to eliminate sin. Think of it, kind of like you want to get rid of COVID. There's a relevant subject. You want to get rid of COVID, you got to get rid of that virus. Suppose we could do that. Now, I understand we've done that with some viruses, like smallpox, for example, has been eradicated. There is no more smallpox. Nobody gets smallpox anymore, which used to be a terrible disease that killed thousands and thousands of people. But not anymore. Smallpox has been eradicated because the smallpox virus has been eradicated. Now, the truth is, I understand it still lives in a freezer in Russia and another freezer somewhere in the U.S., just in case, But it's been removed from the natural environment. So there can never again be smallpox unless human beings reintroduce it back into nature. Suppose we could do something like that for sin. Suppose we could eliminate sin somehow. If we could just remove the infection. The problem is, you see, that the infection of sin doesn't live out in nature. It only lives inside human beings. Now, God has a plan for dealing with sin, and it is called the cross. And Jesus went to the cross, and he paid the price for sin, and he dealt with sin, and he said, "It is finished." The problem is that while that was the death knell for sin and gave us the cure for sin, there are still a lot of people who are reservoirs for sin and who are happily continuing to preserve the sin virus in the world. And the question comes up, what is God going to do about that? how is God going to eradicate the sins without eradicating sin? And how is he going to eradicate sin if human beings continue to give it a nurturing place? They continue to hold on to it. They continue to grow it in themselves. So this, as I see it, is what the judgment is about. God says, look, I am going to remove sin. I'm going to destroy it once and for all. I'm going to cast it into the lake of fire where I put the devil. And I want you to separate from it so that I can destroy sin without destroying you. Are you willing? Are you willing to allow me to take your sin and bear it to the cross and destroy it there once and for all? Or are you really going to keep it? Because if you're really going to keep it, you should know that when I destroy sin, that destruction of sin will destroy you. I don't want to do that. Please don't let it happen. So back at Revelation 20 again, notice that when death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, this is the second death, and anyone whose name is not found written in the book of life, thrown into the lake of fire. That's what it's talking about. It's talking about people who say, no, I don't want to be separated from my sin. I rather like it. You can do whatever you want, but I'm not giving that up. I am not going to allow you to change me. And the end result of that is that when sin is destroyed, death and Hades are destroyed, when the second death comes, then those people are also destroyed. And this is what Scripture refers to as the second death. I think our diagram has had it here. Time to go on to a new one. Okay, does that make sense? So the idea is that here at the end of the millennium, as God finishes up the work of restoration, he has to deal with sin, because sin is the root cause of the infection that has destroyed his world and made it a place of brokenness and a place of sickness and sadness. And so to destroy sin, God must destroy those who refuse to be separated from it, who refuse to allow Jesus to deal with it. Some said that God only has two solutions to sin. One is fire, and the other is blood. The fire is the lake of fire, and the blood, of course, is the blood of Jesus Christ, who cleanses us from all sin. All right, so that brings us to the end of Revelation 20. Now, if this still bothers you, and the idea that God could destroy people, if that still bothers you, consider this for a minute. Suppose God were to say to people who refuse to accept his grace, who refuse to accept Christ, who refuse to be separated from their sin, suppose God were to say, okay, all right, come on in anyway, that's fine. We'll deal with it. Just come on into heaven and be a part of the earth made new. Think about what that would be like for them. To be made to live eternally in a place that they don't want, with a God that they don't like, among people that are not their kind, doing things that they find distasteful. Just think what it would be like. It would not be heaven for them. It would be hell. And so maybe it's really an act of love in which God says, okay, if that's really what you want, you can have it. I think it's C.S. Lewis who says, in the end, everybody gets what they want. Those who want God, get God. Those who don't want God, don't have to have him. And maybe that's the best way for us to look at what's going on here as God restores his universe and puts it back together and makes it once again the wonderful place that he originally intended it to be. He has somehow got to deal with the problem of sin, which means that he somehow got to deal with the problem of those who won't let go of that. Okay, so now after these things are accomplished, Revelation 21, starting with verse 1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. So God has removed the broken, fallen world and created a new heaven and a new earth to replace it. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." So back once again to this messed up, worn out diagram. So here we have God finishing the work of restoration that takes place at the end of this 1,000 years, dealing with the great adversary, Satan, dealing with sin, dealing with death, and ultimately, much to his sorrow, dealing with those who refuse to be a part of his solution to all of this. And now the new age begins, the new heaven and the new earth that will be a recreation of what once was. So we have this parallel, like I said, with Genesis and Revelation serving like bookends here. Genesis describing the beauty of the creation, the horribleness of the fall, and then we ourselves knowing empirically the reality of the broken, sinful world in which we lived. And then Revelation coming in and describing to us the period of restoration in which God restores all things, an act that takes him a while. It's got a lot of stuff that has to happen here, and God deals with all the results of the fall, and he puts it all back together again. And now he once again has a perfect world inhabited by people who are his people and willing to be his people, willing to live for him. Sometimes the question comes up, could sin ever arise again? And I'm happy to be able to say, I've got the answer to that. I don't know. I suppose, given that people are still capable of making free choices, that they could choose wrongly. What would God do? I don't know. I would hope he would nip it in the bud, so to speak. But those are questions that the Bible doesn't give us answers to. So we're just in the realm of speculation there. What the Bible does tell us is that there will come a day when God will make all things new, when he will make everything right, when he will destroy sin, and he will destroy Satan, and he will destroy death, and brokenness will be no more, and wholeness will rule throughout all of eternity. And that Revelation describes to us in great detail. So here's the description in Revelation 22, the last chapter in the Bible, verses 1 through 7. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of this river is the tree of life. Notice that tree of life, by the way. Oops, got the wrong pen here. That tree of life, we saw back in Genesis when God said to the man and the woman, you're going to have to leave the garden because you can no longer have access to the tree of life. But here it is again. It's restored. And notice it produces its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore. Everything has been made right. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it. The servants will worship him. They'll see his face. His name will be on their foreheads. There'll be no more night. They need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. And he said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. For the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. Now, with you, I don't know the meaning of this word soon. This was written a couple of 1,000 years ago. I would say that was a long time ago. I kind of cling to that idea that with God 1 year And 1,000 years are pretty much indistinguishable since he doesn't live linearly in time like we do. But that's a different study for a different time. But the point is that Jesus says, "See, I'm coming soon." I wish soon meant, like really soon. I don't know what it means. But the point is that we, you and I, are supposed to keep the words of the prophecy of this book. In other words, pay attention to it. Be ready for it. We are to live our lives in this world differently. And this takes us back one more time to our other diagram. One of the interesting things that Jesus taught when he came down here and lived with us, here's Jesus, when he lived with us in our broken, sinful world for 30 years, and he taught, told us about God, told us about realities that we wouldn't know about if he didn't tell us, and then, of course, went to the cross and died that we might be free of our guilt and our sin, be reconciled to God through Jesus. When Jesus was here teaching about this and making it possible for all of this to happen so that there could be a restoration, he said an interesting thing to his disciples. He said to them in John, as he was getting ready to leave, he said, "I want you to be in the world, but not of the world. I'm praying to my Father that he will keep you from the evil." So this idea of being in the world, but not of the world, is intriguing. It's as though Jesus taught, yes, I am going to establish a kingdom. Here it is. And it will come at some time in the future. And you don't know when that will be, and I can't tell you. But it will come at some time in the future when this broken, fallen world will give way to a new kingdom, a new heaven and a new earth. In the meantime, I want you, though you have to live in this broken world, to not be of this broken world. You're going to be in it, but you don't have to be of it. I want you to live as though you were living in this kingdom. In fact, Jesus said, I'm going to make it possible for this kingdom that you look forward to actually begin now, so that you, this is you can actually live in this kingdom while you're living in this broken, fallen world. You can be in the world, but not of the world. You can be in the world, but you can breathe the air of the kingdom of heaven. You can be in the world, but you can rejoice just like somebody who's in the kingdom. You can be in the world, but you can be living by the principles of the kingdom of heaven. Remember, Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Well, we can actually be living according to the principles of the kingdom of heaven in this broken world. Now, we're probably not going to do it very well. We're probably certainly not going to do it perfectly. We're going to need God's forgiveness, God's help, God's grace, but we are able, by Jesus Christ, by the power of his Spirit, to live in this broken, sinful world, and at the same time not be of the broken world, but rather to be of the kingdom of God. And those who, by faith, now live in this kingdom, that's you living in the kingdom, and walk in this kingdom, are going to be prepared then for this establishment, this restoration, and in a sense, are going to be able to enjoy some of the blessing of that future kingdom right here in the here and now, as the will of God is being done more and more in your life. And you experience pieces here and there of what you're going to be able to experience in its fullness later on. Now, that I think is a really important idea that Jesus made possible for us, that you and I can live in this broken world, not just looking forward to the kingdom, but actually breathing some of the air of this kingdom, living by the principles of this kingdom in the here and now, treating people as though we were already citizens of the kingdom, believing as though we were already citizens of the kingdom, experiencing fellowship with God in the middle of this broken world. So that's a great thing. So not only is the kingdom of God a future thing, but it's something that we can begin to live now as we begin to live even now through conversion into Jesus Christ an eternal kind of life, even in this broken world. Let me just say one more word about Revelation. There's a lot of stuff in Revelation, and people have interpreted it in so many different ways that the conflicts are amazing. There's lots and lots of symbols, lots of images, lots of stuff drawn from the Old Testament, lots of stuff drawn from Judaism. And I don't know whether people are more helped by all of that or hurt by it. But my approach to it is to kind of step back from it and see the big picture. And the big picture is things get bad, but God puts it all together so that it comes out right in the end. And I think it helps a lot to see how Revelation is a bookend to Genesis, and how it helps us to understand that what was lost will be restored, and just how that works. So maybe if you take a step back from Revelation and you see the bigger picture, maybe it will help you to understand again just how marvelous the work of Christ really is, and just how great the gospel of Jesus Christ is, and just how wonderful God is to make sure that what he originally intended does in fact come through, that it gets done.